When you think of mummies, you probably imagine dusty tombs and ancient curses. But for centuries, mummies weren't just relics of the past. They were commodities, bought, sold, and used in ways few people today would imagine. From medicine to art to something far stranger, this is what happened when the ancient dead entered the modern world. Hi everyone, I'm Joey. Welcome to Studio Joey. For centuries, Europeans consumed powdered mummies as medicine. The practice began with a linguistic mix-up. In the medieval Islamic world, a natural bitumen called mumia was used medicinally. But when Europeans encountered the word, they confused it with mummy and began using actual mummified remains as a substitute. Apothecaries sold ground mummy as a drug believed to help treat bruises, internal bleeding, headaches, epilepsy, and wounds. It was swallowed, mixed into drinks, or rubbed directly onto the body. Travelers like the French physician Guy de la Fontaine later described witnessing the trade in Egypt with unease. By the 18th century, as scientific thinking began to replace medieval remedies, the practice slowly faded. But even as Europeans stopped swallowing mummies, they hadn't quite stopped using them. Some of history's most beautiful paintings were literally painted with the dead. A pigment known as mummy brown was made by grinding material taken from ancient Egyptian mummies, along with the resins and bitumen used to preserve them. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, it was sold across Europe as a rich, transparent brown, prized for shadows and glazing. Most artists had no idea what it was made from. When they eventually learned the truth, that their paint contained the remains of real human beings, many were deeply disturbed. The pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones is said to have buried his tube of mummy brown in his garden after learning what it was made from. By the late 1800s, as supplies of actual mummies dwindled and public attitudes shifted, the pigment eventually fell out of use. But for centuries, painters had been brushing the remains of ancient Egyptians onto canvas. And while artists were unknowingly painting with the dead, others preferred a more direct encounter. In Victorian Britain, mummy unwrappings became a strange form of public spectacle. The surgeon and antiquarian Thomas Pettigrew popularized these events where audience gathered to watch as the linen wrappings of an ancient Egyptian mummy were carefully removed. What had once been a burial became a performance, revealing the preserved body, amulets, and artifacts hidden within the layers of cloth. These gatherings blended science, curiosity, and entertainment, drawing physicians, scholars, and curious guests alike. Pieces of linen and small fragments were sometimes taken away as souvenirs. For many Victorians, the ancient dead had become something to be unwrapped, examined, and displayed. And once a mummy had been unwrapped, its pieces didn't always stay in the lecture hall. During the 19th century's Egyptomania craze, fragments of mummy wrappings and occasionally small pieces of bone were sold as curiosities. Travelers brought them home as souvenirs, and some were mounted in lockets, display cases, or cabinets of curiosities. Owning a piece of the ancient dead was once seen as exotic and fascinating. Only later did attitudes shift, and these keepsakes come to be seen as something far more troubling. But the strangest fate for mummies wasn't in drawing rooms or display cases. It was in the fields. In the late 1880s, locals digging into a strange mound in Egypt uncovered something astonishing. An enormous burial site filled with mummified cats, hundreds of thousands of them. The site lay near ancient cult centers devoted to feline deities like Bastet and Packet, where for centuries, cats had been buried as sacred offerings. To the ancient Egyptians, these cats were religious votives. To Victorian merchants, they were cargo. Around 1890, roughly 180,000 of these cat mummies, nearly 20 tons, were shipped to Liverpool in England and auctioned off. A small number of well-preserved specimens were pulled aside as curiosities or museum pieces. But for the most part, buyers didn't treat them as archaeological treasures. They treated them as agricultural supply. Contemporary Liverpool newspapers noted that the shipment was being sold largely for use as manure. The mummies were crushed and processed, then sold to farmers as fertilizer. So for a brief moment in history, British crops were literally being grown with the remains of sacred Egyptian cats. In Victorian Britain, nothing organic was considered waste, not even a 3,000-year-old mummy. And if ancient remains could be spread across farmland, they could also be thrown into a fire. In the 19th century, the American writer Mark Twain joked that Egyptian locomotives were being fueled by mummies because they were so plentiful. The image was exaggerated, but the underlying behavior was real. Tomb wood, coffin fragments, and even mummy wrappings were sometimes burned as fuel by travelers, excavators, and locals who saw them as cheap, dry material. Ancient remains, stripped of their meaning, became something to throw into a fire, and the past was fed to the flames. From dusty tombs to apothecary shops, art studios, drawing rooms, and farm fields, mummies entered the modern world in ways their makers could never have foreseen. In the Victorian era especially, fascination with ancient Egypt often outweighed respect for it, turning sacred remains into ordinary material. It's a reminder that how we treat the past says as much about us as it does about history. And it raises an uncomfortable question. What are we doing today that future generations may struggle to understand? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.